The bathroom door was locked from the outside. Inside, my husband was pounding on it with his fist, yelling my name. My best friend was crying, telling him to calm down. Water was sloshing over the edge of my bathtub and dripping under the door onto the tile. I stood in the hallway holding my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the wall to steady myself. Paula, Dan shouted, "Open this door right now." Instead, I dialed another number. When the man on the other end answered, I said one sentence. "You better come over now." That was the moment everything in my life split into two parts, before that Thursday afternoon, and everything that came after. I'm Paula Mercer. I was 48 when it happened. I'd been married 22 years to Dan Mercer, who owned a small plumbing company in Evansville, Indiana. Up until that day, I thought my life was pretty ordinary. Quiet house in a subdivision on the west side of town, a husband who worked long hours, a job at a physical therapy clinic where I checked patients in and handled insurance forms. Nothing dramatic. Nothing exciting. But nothing broken either. Or at least that's what I believed. That Thursday started simple enough. Around 2 in the afternoon, my last patient canceled their appointment. A cold front was rolling in off the Ohio River, and half the town had decided to stay home early. My coworker Diane looked over the desk and said, "You might as well head out, Paula. No one else is coming in today." I checked the schedule twice just to be sure. "All right," I said. "I'll grab dinner stuff on the way home." I remember feeling almost cheerful driving out of the parking lot. The sky had that pale gray fall color we get here in southern Indiana right before the weather turns cold. Leaves were blowing across the road. You could smell wood smoke from somebody's chimney. I stopped at Meijer like I usually did. Grabbed a rotisserie chicken, potato salad, coffee creamer. Dan liked the hazelnut kind and we were almost out. I even picked up a small pumpkin pie because he'd mentioned earlier that week he was craving one. Looking back, that part almost makes me laugh. There I was buying dessert for the man who was busy ruining our marriage. When I pulled into our driveway around 3:30, the first thing that caught my eye was Dan's truck. It was parked crooked like he'd pulled in fast. That didn't make sense. He was supposed to be across the river in Henderson installing a water heater for a restaurant kitchen. That job was supposed to take all afternoon. I remember sitting in the car for a moment thinking maybe the job had gotten canceled. That happens sometimes in construction. But something about the house felt strange the second I walked through the garage door. It was too quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of an empty home. The uneasy kind. And then I smelled it. Perfume. Strong. Sweet. Not mine. I stood there in the kitchen holding a bag of groceries, breathing slowly, trying to place the scent. Then it hit me. Terry. Terry Barlow had worn that exact perfume for years. Cheap, strong, impossible to ignore. Terry wasn't just an acquaintance. She'd been my best friend for 11 years. We'd met at a church fundraiser when our kids were still in middle school. Lunch dates. Garage sales. Helping each other after surgeries and family problems. She'd sat in this very kitchen drinking coffee more times than I could count. That's probably why the next thing I saw felt so unreal. Her leopard print blouse was draped over the chair by the hallway. For a few seconds my brain tried to make excuses. Maybe she stopped by. Maybe Dan had come home early too. Maybe. Then I saw the wine glasses. 2 of them. Half empty on the counter. Dan never drank wine in the middle of the day. My stomach started tightening. I walked down the hallway slowly. On the floor I saw Dan's belt. Then a pair of jeans. Then a bra. Terry's. There was water on the tile leading toward the master bathroom. And from inside that room I heard laughter. Low. Comfortable. Familiar. My chest felt like it was caving in. But somehow my legs kept moving. I reached the bathroom door and pushed it open. What I saw inside is something I'll never completely forget. Dan and Terry sitting together in the big soaking tub we installed during our bathroom remodel 3 years earlier. The tub I'd picked out myself. At the time, it had felt like a little reward after months of physical therapy for a back injury. A place to relax. Now it was full of bath bubbles and 2 naked people staring at me like I was the one interrupting something. For a second, no one spoke. Dan blinked like he'd just been caught cheating on a math test. "Paula," he said carefully, "this isn't what it—" Terry grabbed a towel and tried to cover herself. "Oh my God," she whispered. But I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I just looked at them. Then I stepped backward out of the room, closed the door, and walked to the linen closet. There's a little metal key in there we keep because the bathroom lock sticks sometimes. I picked it up, turned the lock from the outside, and listened. Inside the bathroom, Dan started pounding on the door. "Paula, what the hell are you doing?" Terry began crying. "Please open the door." Their voices sounded panicked now. The calm laughter from a minute earlier had vanished. I walked back into the living room, turned on the television. Some afternoon news program was talking about traffic delays on Interstate 69. The normal sound of a weekday afternoon filled the house. Behind me, the banging on the bathroom door continued. I sat on the couch. My hands were shaking so hard I had to set the grocery bag down before I dropped it. I kept staring at the pumpkin pie. That stupid pie suddenly felt like the saddest thing in the world. I picked up my phone, scrolled to a name. Glenn Barlow. Terry's husband. Glenn ran the Napa Auto Parts store over on Green River Road. He was one of the calmest men I'd ever met. Quiet. Hardworking. The kind of person who fixed things instead of complaining about them. The phone rang twice. Then Glenn answered. "Hello." My voice sounded strangely steady when I spoke. "You better come over, now." There was a pause. "Paula, what's going on?" I looked down the hallway toward the locked bathroom door. Water was starting to seep out under it. "Bring your eyes," I said, "that's all." Glenn didn't ask another question. "I'm on my way." When the call ended, I sat there listening to the sounds in my house. The television. The pounding on the door. The muffled arguing. My marriage falling apart in real time. 10 minutes later, a pickup truck pulled into the driveway. I walked to the front door and opened it. Glenn stepped out of the driver's seat. But he wasn't alone. A smaller figure climbed out of the passenger side. Even from the porch light, I recognized her immediately. Marlene Barlow. Terry's 72-year-old mother. Glenn walked up the steps and said quietly, "My mother-in-law heard part of the call when I was leaving her house." Marlene folded her arms and looked me straight in the eye. "If my daughter's doing what I think she's doing," she said, "I'm not missing it." Behind us, Dan slammed his shoulder into the bathroom door again. "Paula." I stepped aside and let them both inside. Something told me the real storm hadn't even started yet. Glenn closed the front door behind him, and the three of us stood there for a moment in the quiet living room. The television kept talking about traffic conditions on Interstate 69 like nothing unusual was happening. Down the hallway, my husband slammed his fist against the bathroom door again. "Paula, this isn't funny." Marlene tilted her head toward the noise. "That him?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "And my daughter?" "Yes." She nodded once, like someone confirming a suspicion she'd had for a long time. "Well," she said calmly, "let's go see what kind of mess she's made." We walked down the hallway together. Dan must have heard the footsteps because the pounding stopped. "Paula," he said, "who's out there?" I didn't answer. Glenn stepped forward and spoke through the door. "It's Glenn." The silence on the other side of that door was instant. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Then Terry's voice came through, shaky and small. "Glenn." He didn't raise his voice. Glenn wasn't the yelling type. "How long?" he asked. No one answered. I could hear the faint slosh of bathwater, the creak of someone shifting in the tub. Finally, Terry said, "It's not what you think." Marlene let out a soft snort. "Oh, honey," she muttered under her breath, "it's exactly what we think." Inside the bathroom, Dan cleared his throat. "Glenn, listen, things just got a little—" "Stop," Glenn said quietly. His voice didn't rise, but it carried a weight I had never heard before. "How long?" Terry started crying. "A few months," she said. "Just a few months." That's what she said. But Dan stayed silent, and that silence told me more than any confession could have. I looked at Glenn. He was staring straight at the door. Not angry, not shouting, just very still. Then he took his phone out of his pocket and turned on the camera. "Paula," he said gently, "unlock the door." My hand tightened around the little metal key. For a second I thought about leaving them in there, letting them sit with their lies a little longer. But Glenn deserved to see the truth. So I stepped forward, turned the lock, and opened the door. The bathroom looked like something out of a bad sitcom. Steam hung in the air. Water had spilled across the tile. Dan and Terry were still sitting in the tub, both wrapped awkwardly in towels. The moment the door opened, Dan jumped into action. Terry slipped, he said quickly. She hit her head. I was helping her. Glenn slowly lifted his phone and pointed it at the room. 2 wine glasses sat on the vanity. A scented candle burned beside them. Clothes were scattered everywhere. Dan stopped talking. The lie collapsed under its own weight. Terry looked from Glenn to her mother and back again. "Mama," she whispered. Marlene stared at her for a long time. Then she said something I don't think anyone in that room will ever forget. "I didn't raise a thief, Terry." Terry blinked. "What?" Marlene stepped farther into the doorway. "You heard me." Her voice was calm, almost tired. "You didn't just steal another woman's husband. You tried to steal the life she built." Terry shook her head quickly. "That's not—" "Oh, it absolutely is," Marlene said. Dan tried to regain control of the conversation. "Everyone needs to calm down," he said. "This is getting blown way out of proportion." Glenn finally looked at him. Not angry. Not yelling. Just deeply disappointed. "Is it?" he asked. Dan didn't answer. Marlene turned toward Glenn. "Tell her," she said. Glenn hesitated for a second. Then he spoke. "This morning I checked our savings account," he said quietly. Terry stiffened in the tub. Glenn continued. $20,000 is gone." Terry opened her mouth. But Glenn wasn't finished. "I also talked to a realtor friend of mine." My stomach tightened. Dan shifted his weight in the tub. "Glenn," he said carefully, "this isn't the place for—" "You and my wife have been looking at property near Lake Barkley," Glenn said. The bathroom went completely still. Even the dripping faucet seemed to pause. Glenn looked at me then. I figured Paula deserved to know too. I felt the words hit my chest like cold water. Lake Barkley. That wasn't a vacation plan. That was a new life. Dan tried to laugh it off. "Look, we talked about buying a place someday," he said. "That doesn't mean—" "With money from Mercer Plumbing?" Glenn asked. Dan's face changed. Just a little. But enough. I suddenly remembered something. 3 months earlier I had signed an invoice for equipment Dan said he needed for a commercial job. $8,000. The equipment never showed up. At the time, I assumed the supplier was delayed. Now the pieces started falling together. Marlene folded her arms. "Let me get this straight," she said. She pointed at Terry. "You take money from your husband." Then she pointed at Dan. "You take money from your business. And the 2 of you plan to run off to some lake cabin together." No one answered. Terry started crying again. "It wasn't like that," she said. Glenn looked at her. "Then what was it like?" Terry couldn't answer. Dan rubbed his forehead. "This whole thing is getting ridiculous," he muttered. But no one in that room believed him anymore. I stood there looking at the 2 people I had trusted the most outside my own family. And something inside me changed. Up until that moment, I thought the worst part of the day was discovering the affair. I was wrong. The worst part was realizing they had planned it. Planned a future that didn't include me. Using money I helped earn. Marlene turned to me. "I'm sorry, Paula," she said quietly. It sounded genuine. But the apology didn't fix anything. I walked back down the hallway without saying another word. Behind me, the argument started again. Voices raised. Towels rustling. Water splashing onto the floor. I stepped outside onto the porch. The air had gotten colder. Leaves scraped across the driveway. Glenn eventually came out a few minutes later. He leaned against the porch railing beside me. Neither of us spoke at first. Finally, he said I suspected something. I nodded slowly. "So did I admitted. But I didn't want to be right." He sighed. "I checked our bank account this morning because a bill bounced," he said. That's when I started digging. I stared out at the street. A neighbor's dog barked in the distance. "Dan told me he had a big commercial job coming up," I said. Glenn shook his head. "Maybe he does," he said, "but I doubt it." We stood there in silence for another minute. Inside the house, Marlene's voice rose above the others. "You should both be ashamed of yourselves." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the whole situation had become so absurd. Finally, Glenn looked at me. "What are you going to do now?" he asked. The truth was I didn't know yet. But one thought kept circling in my mind. This wasn't just an affair. It was a plan. And plans have consequences. That night, I packed a bag and drove to my sister Janice's house in Newburgh. As I pulled out of the driveway, I looked at the house one last time. The porch light was still on. Dan's truck sat crooked in the driveway. Inside that house were two people who thought they had already written the ending of my story. They were wrong. Because somewhere between discovering the affair and hearing about that lake cabin, I stopped feeling like the victim and started thinking about strategy. The first night at my sister Janice's house, I barely slept. Her place was a small ranch just outside Newburgh, the kind of quiet neighborhood where you could hear crickets at night and the occasional truck rolling down State Road 66. Janice made up the guest room with fresh sheets and left a glass of water on the nightstand. She didn't ask a lot of questions. That's one thing about my sister. When something bad happens, she doesn't hover. She gives you space until you're ready to talk. Around midnight, I sat on the edge of the bed staring at my phone. Dan had already left 4 voicemails. I didn't listen to them yet. I knew exactly what they would sound like. Excuses. Promises. Maybe even a little anger thrown in once he realized I wasn't picking up. Instead, I opened my photo gallery. The first picture that popped up was from our 20th anniversary. Dan and I standing on the riverfront downtown, smiling like we had the world figured out. 22 years together. I stared at that photo for a long time before setting the phone down. Janice knocked softly on the door. "You awake?" "Yeah." She walked in carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to me and sat in the chair by the window. For a while we didn't say anything. Then she asked the question everyone eventually asks. "So what are you thinking?" I rubbed my forehead. "I don't know yet." Janice nodded. "That's all right," she said, "but here's one thing you shouldn't do." "What's that?" "Don't burn the house down." I gave her a tired look. "That wasn't really on my list." She shrugged. "Good, because you're going to want that credit score later." That was Janice. Even in the middle of a disaster, she was thinking about mortgage rates and financial stability. And strangely enough, that grounded me. Because once the shock started wearing off, my mind began drifting toward something else. Numbers. Dan always handled the job sites. But I handled the paperwork. Invoices. Payroll. Permits. QuickBooks entries. For years, I'd kept the books for Mercer Plumbing from the desk in our spare bedroom. I knew where every dollar should have been. The next morning, Janice went to work early. She runs a small insurance office and opens the place at 8. Before she left, she set a legal pad on the kitchen table. "You're good with numbers," she said. "Start there." I drove back to my house around 9. Dan's truck wasn't in the driveway. Neither was Terry's car. The house looked exactly the same as when I left. Quiet. Still, like the walls were pretending nothing had happened. I walked straight to the spare bedroom. Turned on the computer. Opened the accounting software. At first, everything looked normal. But when I started digging deeper, patterns began appearing. Small transfers labeled as subcontractor payments. Equipment purchases that never arrived. Charges spread across several months. Not huge amounts individually. But together they added up. 8,000 here. 4,000 there. Another 6,000 2 weeks later. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the screen. Dan hadn't taken one big chunk. He'd taken pieces. Slowly. Carefully. Like someone scooping water out of a bucket, hoping no one would notice the level dropping. Then I checked the company email account. Nothing unusual. But something nagged at me. So I opened the browser history. And there it was. A Gmail account. busterandbella@gmail.com. I almost laughed. Buster and Bella were our dogs, golden retrievers. We'd named them together. Apparently Dan thought that was clever enough for a secret email. I logged in. He'd saved the password in the browser. The inbox had dozens of messages, most of them between Dan and Terry. Property listings, photos of cabins, discussions about docks and lake access. One message from a realtor near Lake Barkley mentioned a deposit already placed. Another included spreadsheets calculating future expenses. Reading those emails felt like watching strangers plan a life that used to belong to me. I closed the laptop slowly. Then I picked up my phone and finally listened to Dan's voicemails. The first one sounded almost casual. "Paula, listen. We need to talk about what happened yesterday." The second one sounded defensive. You completely overreacted locking us in that bathroom. The third one tried a different approach. We're adults, we can handle this privately. I played that third message again. Janice came home for lunch around noon and heard it too. She leaned against the counter and shook her head. Private, she said. He was naked in your bathtub with your best friend. We both laughed. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes laughter is the only thing that keeps you from crying. After lunch, Janice asked the question again. What are you going to do? I hesitated. Part of me wanted to walk away quietly. Sell the house? Start over somewhere else? But another thought had started growing in the back of my mind. Terry had already started telling people a story. According to a mutual friend who texted me that morning, she was saying I'd had some kind of emotional breakdown. That I locked them in the bathroom because I'd lost control. I stared at my phone for a long moment after reading that. Janice noticed. What's wrong? I handed her the message. She read it and raised an eyebrow. So now you're the crazy one. Apparently. Janice set the phone down. Well, she said if people are going to tell stories about you, you might as well tell the real one first. That's when something clicked in my head. Saturday night. Mercer County Home and Garden Trade Night. Dan had been talking about that event for weeks. The fairgrounds would be full of local contractors, homeowners, suppliers, and community leaders. Dan was scheduled to give a short speech. About business values. About trust. About being a family-owned company. I stared at the legal pad on the table. Then at the financial records on my laptop. Then at the text message spreading rumors about me. A calm feeling settled over me. For the first time since Thursday afternoon, the shaking stopped. Janice watched my expression change. Uh-oh, she said slowly. What? That look? What look? The one you used to get before high school debates. I smiled slightly. If they want to tell stories about me, I said, then I'll tell the truth. Janice leaned back in her chair. Oh, she said. Now this I want to see. Outside the kitchen window, the wind picked up and rattled the dry leaves in the yard. Saturday night was only 2 days away. And for the first time since the affair began, I had a plan. By Saturday evening, the Mercer County Fairgrounds parking lot was already half full. Pickup trucks lined the gravel rows. People walked toward the main building carrying crockpots, folding chairs, and boxes of brochures. Trade night had been a local tradition for years. Contractors set up booths, local banks sponsored raffles, and half the town showed up to talk business and eat free barbecue. The air smelled like smoked ribs and kettle corn. Inside the big metal building, strings of lights hung across the ceiling beams. Kids ran past tables stacked with tool catalogs. Church ladies sold homemade pies near the entrance. It was exactly the kind of place where reputations were built and destroyed. I arrived a few minutes before Dan's speech was scheduled. Janice walked in beside me. You ready? She asked quietly. I adjusted my coat and nodded. I think so. Glenn stood near the back wall talking with one of the hardware suppliers. When he saw us, he gave a small nod. Not a smile. Just quiet acknowledgement. Marlene sat at one of the folding tables with a slice of apple pie in front of her, watching the crowd like a general observing a battlefield. Terry wasn't hard to spot. She stood near a floral display booth with one of her cousins, laughing a little too loudly at something someone said. For a second, our eyes met across the room. Her smile froze. Then she quickly looked away. I walked past her without slowing down. My heart was beating hard now. But my hands were steady. At the front of the room, a small stage had been set up with a microphone and a banner reading, Mercer County Home and Garden Trade Night. Dan stood near the podium talking with 2 men from the Chamber of Commerce. He looked polished. Clean jeans, company quarter zip jacket with the Mercer Plumbing logo stitched on the chest. And on his wrist the watch I gave him for our 20th anniversary. The sight of that watch almost stopped me in my tracks. 22 years of marriage. Reduced to a few pieces of metal and glass reflecting the overhead lights. Dan noticed me then. His face changed instantly. Surprise first. Then irritation. Then something close to panic. He walked toward me quickly. Paula, he said under his breath, what are you doing here? I came to listen, I said. This isn't the time for... Relax, I interrupted. You're about to give a speech, right? He glanced around nervously. You need to leave. Why? His jaw tightened. Because you're making a scene. I almost laughed at that. But before he could say anything else, one of the event organizers stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone. The sharp squeal of feedback cut through the room. People began gathering around the stage. Dan took a slow breath and stepped back toward the podium. For a moment I thought maybe I'd lose my nerve. Maybe I'd walk out the door and let him keep pretending everything was fine. But then he started speaking. "Good evening, everyone," Dan said confidently into the microphone. "For those who don't know me, I'm Dan Mercer, owner of Mercer Plumbing. We've been proud to serve this community for over 20 years. The crowd nodded politely. Dan continued. "My father always told me that running a family business is about trust. It's about values. It's about building something solid your neighbors can rely on." Standing there listening to him talk about trust nearly made me dizzy. This man had been sitting in my bathtub with my best friend 48 hours earlier, planning a second life using money from the business we built together. And now he was giving a speech about integrity. That's when I knew. I wasn't leaving. Near the side of the stage stood Rebecca Sloan, the attorney I'd met earlier that week. She gave me a small nod. Everything was ready. When Dan finished the first part of his speech, Rebecca leaned toward the event organizer and said something quietly. The organizer looked surprised, then confused. But after a moment he nodded. Dan was just beginning another sentence when Rebecca stepped onto the stage. "Excuse me, Dan," she said politely. He blinked. "What's this?" "Mrs. Mercer has a statement regarding the business." Dan looked at me like he'd just been punched. "Paula." But it was too late. I stepped up onto the stage. The microphone hummed softly as I adjusted it. For a second the room was completely silent. I could see nearly everyone we knew. Neighbors, suppliers, church friends, the local bank manager. People who had trusted Mercer Plumbing for years. I took a breath. "My name is Paula Mercer," I said. My voice sounded calm. Almost too calm. "I've helped manage the bookkeeping for Mercer Plumbing for many years." Dan stepped closer. "Paula, don't..." I raised my hand slightly. He stopped talking. The room waited. "Tonight my husband spoke about trust and family values," I continued. "And I agree those things matter." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Then I said the next words very clearly. "Which is why I feel obligated to tell you that Dan Mercer has been engaged in an affair with my longtime friend Terry Barlow." The crowd went completely still. Across the room, Terry's face drained of color. Dan whispered harshly, "Stop." But I kept going. 2 days ago I came home early and discovered them together in my house. Someone gasped. Glenn stepped forward near the front of the crowd. Rebecca handed me a folder. I held it up slightly. Over the past several months, money has also been quietly moved from Mercer Plumbing accounts, while plans were being made for a separate life outside this marriage. Dan lunged toward the microphone, but 2 event organizers stepped between us. "This isn't necessary," Dan snapped. From the 3rd row, Marlene's voice rang out. "Oh, it absolutely is." Several people turned toward her. She stood up slowly, setting her pie plate down on the table. "Nobody accidentally ends up naked in a bubble bath with a married plumber," she said. A ripple of shocked laughter moved through the crowd. Glenn stepped beside the stage. "I'm filing for divorce too," he said calmly. "Not for drama, for the truth." Dan's shoulders sagged slightly. In that moment, the confident business owner who'd been smiling 10 minutes earlier seemed to shrink. People in the crowd began whispering. One of the local contractors leaned toward another and muttered something I couldn't hear. The reputation Dan had spent years building was unraveling in real time. Terry quietly slipped out the side door. As Marlene walked past her, she said just loud enough for nearby people to hear, "Don't eat that pie, honey. You won't be able to swallow the shame." I stepped away from the microphone. The room buzzed with stunned conversation. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I simply told the truth. And sometimes that's more powerful than any shouting match. Dan tried to approach me again, but Glenn stepped into his path. Not threatening, just firm. The event organizer cleared his throat nervously and said something about a short break before the next presentation. Janice squeezed my shoulder. "You did it," she whispered. I looked around the room one last time. Every face told the same story. The secret was no longer a secret. And the man who thought he controlled the narrative didn't anymore. The months after that night didn't feel like victory. They felt like cleanup. Legal paperwork stacked up fast, divorce filings, financial disclosures, account reviews, the quiet, grinding process of untangling 22 years of shared life. Dan tried calling me several times during the first week. I didn't answer. Eventually, he started leaving messages again. But the tone had changed. Gone was the confident voice from those earlier voicemails. Now he sounded tired, defensive, sometimes angry. "You embarrassed me in front of the entire town," one message said. Another one came 2 days later. "You didn't have to make it public like that." I listened to that message once, then deleted it. Because the truth was simple. He had already made it public. I had just turned on the lights. Rebecca Sloan handled most of the legal conversations after that. She was calm and practical, the kind of lawyer who spoke in measured sentences and never wasted words. One afternoon in her office, she slid a stack of documents across the desk toward me. "Your husband moved more money than we originally thought," she said. "How much?" "Almost $45,000 over the last year." I exhaled slowly. That number didn't surprise me anymore. "What happens now?" I asked. Rebecca folded her hands. "Now the court decides how the assets get divided." Outside her office window, the courthouse square looked quiet and ordinary. People walking dogs, a couple sitting on a bench eating ice cream. Life kept moving forward whether marriages survived or not. Dan lost 2 contracts within the first month. Word travels fast in a place like Evansville. Contractors talk. Customers talk even more. A plumber whose finances were under investigation wasn't someone many homeowners wanted working in their kitchens. Glenn filed for divorce the same week I did. I saw him once outside the Napa store when I stopped in to buy windshield wipers. He rang up the sale and handed me the receipt. For a second, we just stood there. Finally, he said, "Well, that was one hell of a week." I nodded. "Yeah." He shrugged. "At least now we know the truth." There wasn't much else to say. Sometimes shared disappointment doesn't need a long conversation. Terry moved out of her house and went to stay with relatives in Owensboro. I heard that from Marlene, who called me one afternoon just to apologize again. "You didn't deserve any of this," she said. Her voice sounded tired. "I'm sorry for the part my daughter played in it." I told her something honest. I'm sorry, too. Because even though Terry had betrayed me, the situation had wrecked more than just my marriage. Families don't break quietly. They crack in every direction. Not everyone supported what I did. A few people avoided me at the grocery store. One woman from church told Janice she thought I should have handled things privately. Maybe she was right. But the strange thing was more people supported me than I expected. One afternoon, a man named Carl Simmons called. Carl owned a heating and cooling company across town. "I heard you handled the books for Mercer Plumbing," he said. "That's right." Well, Carl continued, "I could use someone part-time who understands contractors and invoices, and I respect how you handled that situation." I smiled at the phone. "What situation?" He chuckled. "You know exactly which one." Within a few weeks, I was helping with his company's bookkeeping. The work felt familiar. Numbers made sense in a way people sometimes didn't. Slowly, my life started settling into a new rhythm. I moved back into the house after Dan found an apartment. Janice came over the first weekend to help me rearrange a few things. We didn't redecorate the entire place, but we made a few small changes. New bedspread, different curtains in the living room, and one afternoon I replaced the bathroom lock. Not because it was broken, just because I wanted to. One evening in late January, I stood in the kitchen stirring a pot of chili on the stove. Snow tapped softly against the window. The house felt quieter than it used to, but not empty. Honest. That's the best word I can find for it. For a long time after the divorce papers were finalized, people kept asking me the same question. "Do you regret what you did?" The truth is complicated. No one enjoys watching their life fall apart. No one wants to discover their marriage was built on lies. And revenge, well, revenge isn't the clean, satisfying feeling people imagine. It's messy. It hurts. It leaves scars. But sometimes telling the truth out loud is the only way to reclaim your own story. One afternoon, several months later, I ran into Dan at a gas station on the edge of town. He looked older, more tired. For a moment, we just stood there beside the pumps. Finally, he said, "You ruined my reputation." I studied his face. Then I answered quietly, "You did that yourself." He didn't argue. He just nodded once and got back into his truck. I watched him drive away without feeling the anger I expected. Mostly I felt relief. Because the strange thing about betrayal is that it forces you to learn something about yourself. I had spent years trying to protect a version of my marriage that didn't actually exist anymore. When the truth finally came out, it hurt. But it also set me free. That winter night in my kitchen, I tasted the chili and added a little more salt. The radio played softly in the background. Outside, the snow kept falling. And for the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something I was finally allowed to write myself. I didn't win because Dan lost. I won because I stopped letting his lies decide what kind of woman I was. If you've ever had to rebuild your life after someone you trusted broke it apart, then you probably understand that feeling. And if this story meant something to you tonight, thank you for listening. Sometimes sharing the truth helps more people than we realize.